The morning fog clung to the Rodriguez family farm like a shroud, muffling the sounds of Ashley's footsteps as she made her way to the chicken coop. 3 months had passed since Grandpa Eduardo's funeral, and every sunrise felt like a countdown to disaster. The property taxes were due in 6 weeks. The bank had already sent 2 warning letters about the mortgage, and Tom's disability checks barely covered groceries, let alone the mounting pile of medical bills from his therapy sessions. Ashley pulled her worn cardigan tighter against the October chill as she scattered feed for the chickens. At 28, she looked older than her years, stress lines etched around her green eyes, and her auburn hair pulled back in a perpetually messy bun. The pregnancy wasn't showing yet. She was barely 8 weeks along, but she could feel the weight of another life depending on decisions they weren't qualified to make. "Charlie, get back here!" Tom's voice carried across the yard, hoarse from another sleepless night. Their golden retriever had developed an obsession with the area behind the old barn, spending hours digging in the same spot, despite Tom's attempts to redirect him. Ashley finished with the chickens and walked toward the commotion. Tom stood with his hands on his hips, his dark hair disheveled and his flannel shirt untucked. Even at 31, he carried himself like an old man sometimes, the invisible weight of 3 tours in Afghanistan pressing down on his shoulders. "That damn dog's been at it since dawn," Tom said, not looking at her. "Grandpa would have skinned him alive for tearing up the property like this." The mention of Eduardo Rodriguez hung between them like smoke. The old man had been the anchor of their small family, the one who'd kept the 100-acre farm running even as arthritis gnarled his hands, and age bent his spine. When the heart attack took him in his sleep, it felt like losing a father, grandfather, and business partner all at once. "Maybe he smells something," Ashley suggested, crouching down to examine Charlie's excavation project. The hole was deeper than she'd realized, nearly 2 feet down and widening. "Remember when he found that family of possums under the porch?" Tom snorted. "This is different. Look at him." Charlie had indeed resumed digging with an intensity that bordered on manic. His golden coat was caked with mud, his paws working furiously as dirt flew behind him. Every few seconds, he'd pause to sniff deeply at something in the hole, tail wagging with excitement before attacking the earth again. "Tom, I think you should see this." Ashley's voice had changed, taking on the careful tone she used when she was trying not to alarm him. Tom's therapist called it walking on eggshells, and they were both guilty of it, treating each other like fragile things that might shatter with the wrong word or gesture. She was kneeling by the hole now, her hands dirty from pulling away loose soil. "There's something here, something metal." Tom joined her, his knees protesting as he crouched down. At the bottom of Charlie's excavation, barely visible beneath a layer of clay and debris, something gleamed dully in the morning light. "Probably just an old pipe or something," Tom muttered, but his hands were already reaching into the hole. His fingers closed around something small and round, and when he pulled it up, both of them fell silent. The object in his palm was unmistakably a coin, but unlike anything either of them had seen outside of a museum. About the size of a silver dollar, it was tarnished with age, but still showed intricate details. Liberty's profile faced left, surrounded by 13 stars, with the date 1847 clearly visible. On the reverse side, an eagle spread its wings above a shield. "Jesus," Ashley breathed. "Is that real silver?" Tom's hands were shaking slightly. Whether from excitement or the lingering tremor that sometimes accompanied his anxiety, she couldn't tell. "I think so. Look at the weight of it." Charlie had resumed digging, apparently satisfied that the humans were finally paying attention to his discovery. As they watched, his nose pushed against something else in the disturbed earth. "There's more," Ashley said. They worked together now, Tom's larger hands pulling away clumps of clay, while Ashley used a garden trowel she'd retrieved from the barn. Within 20 minutes, they'd unearthed 17 more coins, each one bearing dates from the 1840s and 1850s. The silver pieces lay in Ashley's lap like fallen stars, their combined weight substantial enough that her legs were beginning to go numb. "We need to stop," Tom said suddenly, looking around the property with new eyes. "If there are this many here—" "You think there are more?" "Charlie sure seems to think so." They wrapped the coins in an old dish towel and headed back to the house, Charlie trotting alongside them with the satisfied air of a job well done. The farmhouse had belonged to the Rodriguez family for 4 generations, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that Eduardo had rebuilt twice in his lifetime. Inside, the furniture was a mixture of hand-me-downs and thrift store finds, comfortable but showing its age. Ashley spread the coins across the kitchen table while Tom fired up his ancient laptop. The machine wheezed to life, its fan working overtime as they waited for the internet to load. 1847 Liberty Head silver dollars, Tom read from an auction site. Condition varies. Jesus Christ, Ashley, look at this. The screen showed a similar coin, graded as fine condition, with a current bid of $1,200. Another, in better shape, was listed at $2,800. "That's just one coin," Ashley whispered. Tom was already doing math in his head, his expression shifting from disbelief to something approaching hope. "Even at the low end, if these are authentic, we're looking at maybe $20,000, maybe more." $20,000. It was more money than either of them had ever seen in one place, enough to catch up on the mortgage payments, cover the property taxes, maybe even buy Tom a reliable truck to replace the dying Ford in their driveway. "We should have them appraised," Ashley said, her practical nature asserting itself. "Make sure they're real before we get too excited." "Dr. Morrison might know someone," Tom suggested. "She's always posting about local history on Facebook. Maybe she's dealt with old coins before." Dr. Helena Morrison was a semi-retired history professor who lived in the town of Millbrook, about 15 minutes from their farm. She'd made a name for herself, writing books about the settlement patterns of 19th-century Tennessee, and had consulted on several archaeological projects in the region. More importantly, she had a reputation for honesty that was rare among academics. Tom was already reaching for his phone when Charlie started barking from the backyard, the sharp, insistent sound he made when strangers approached the property. Through the kitchen window they could see a black Mercedes SUV making its way up their gravel driveway, its pristine finish looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of their struggling farm. "You expecting someone?" Ashley asked, but Tom was already shaking his head. The SUV parked near the front porch, and they watched as a man in an expensive suit climbed out. He was probably in his mid-40s, with silver-grey hair and the kind of posture that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. Even from a distance, they could see the Rolex on his wrist glinting in the sunlight. "Connor Rodriguez?" The man's voice carried clearly across the yard as Tom stepped onto the porch. "I'm Mitchell Hartwell from Hartwell, Blackstone and Associates. I represent Connor Rodriguez." Tom felt his stomach drop. Connor Rodriguez. His cousin, technically, though they'd spoken maybe a dozen times in their entire lives. Connor was everything Tom wasn't. Successful, polished, connected to the right people. He owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 counties and lived in a mansion outside Nashville with his surgeon wife and their 2 perfectly groomed children. "What does Connor want with me?" Tom asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. Hartwell climbed the porch steps with the confident stride of a man who'd never been told no. "Mr. Rodriguez, Connor Rodriguez has some concerns about the estate settlement, specifically about certain irregularities in your grandfather's will." Ashley appeared at Tom's side, instinctively moving closer to him. "What kind of irregularities?" "I'm afraid that's a matter for family discussion," Hartwell said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Perhaps we could speak privately, Mr. Rodriguez. These matters can be quite delicate. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my wife." Hartwell's pause was calculated, designed to make them sweat. "Very well. My client has reason to believe that Eduardo Rodriguez's will may have been influenced by his declining mental state in his final years. There are questions about his capacity to make certain bequests, particularly regarding property that has significant historical and monetary value. Grandpa was sharp as a tack until the day he died, Tom said, his voice rising. Anyone who knew him would tell you that. I'm sure he seemed that way to family members, Hartwell replied smoothly, but official medical records suggest otherwise. Did you know, for instance, that your grandfather was prescribed medication for early-stage dementia 6 months before his death? The words hit Tom like a physical blow. Ashley felt him tense beside her, his breathing becoming shallow in the way that meant he was fighting off a panic attack. That's not true, Tom said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I have the records right here, Hartwell said, producing a manila folder from his briefcase. Prescribed by Dr. Patricia Wells, his longtime physician. The medication was for mild cognitive impairment, a precursor to Alzheimer's disease. Ashley took the folder with numb fingers, scanning the medical documents inside. The letterhead was official, the doctor's signature clear, and there it was in black and white. Eduardo Rodriguez, diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, prescribed Aricept to slow the progression of memory loss. Even if this is true, Ashley said, her voice steadier than she felt, it doesn't invalidate his will. Mild cognitive impairment doesn't mean he was incompetent. Perhaps not, Hartwell conceded, but combined with other evidence, the unusual nature of certain bequests, the timing of property transfers, the lack of proper legal counsel during the will's creation, it certainly raises questions about undue influence. What the hell are you talking about? Tom's face was flushed now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Undue influence from who? From you, Mr. Rodriguez, and your wife. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ashley felt the world tilt slightly, as if the porch had shifted beneath her feet. You're suggesting we manipulated a sick old man into leaving us his property? She asked. I'm not suggesting anything, Hartwell replied. I'm simply presenting evidence that my client believes warrants investigation, evidence that suggests Eduardo Rodriguez was not in full possession of his faculties when he signed his final will, and that certain family members may have taken advantage of his condition. Tom was breathing heavily now, the telltale signs of an anxiety attack beginning to manifest. Ashley reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away, pacing to the edge of the porch. "Get off my property," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Of course," Hartwell said, his professional demeanor never wavering. "But I should mention that my client is prepared to contest the will in court. He's also prepared to make this matter public, which could be unfortunate for your reputation in the community." He handed Ashley a business card before turning to leave. "When you're ready to discuss a reasonable settlement, please don't hesitate to call. My client is not an unreasonable man. He simply wants what's rightfully his." They watched the Mercedes disappear down their driveway, leaving only a cloud of dust and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Tom had sunk into one of the porch chairs, his head in his hands. "Tom, we need to call a lawyer," Ashley said. "With what money?" His voice was muffled by his palms. "We can barely afford groceries, and you want to go up against Connor Rodriguez in court." Ashley looked down at the business card in her hand, then back toward the barn where Charlie had made his discovery. The coins were still sitting on their kitchen table, wrapped in a dish towel like ordinary tableware. "Maybe we don't have to," she said quietly. Tom looked up at her, confused. "The coins, Tom, if they're really worth what we think they are, you want to sell them without even knowing where they came from or why they were buried there?" "I want to save our home," Ashley said. "I want to save our family." She placed her hand on her still flat stomach, and Tom's expression softened slightly. The baby was due in May, and they'd already started talking about converting Eduardo's old office into a nursery. The thought of raising their child anywhere else felt like giving up on everything they'd ever hoped for. "We need to know what we're dealing with first," Tom said finally. "Let's call Dr. Morrison, find out what these coins are worth, where they came from. Then we'll figure out our next move." As they headed back into the house, neither of them noticed Charlie returning to his excavation site, his nose working overtime as he caught the scent of something else buried in the Tennessee clay. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about Eduardo Rodriguez and the family legacy he'd left behind. The coins on their kitchen table were just the beginning. Dr. Helena Morrison's house sat on the outskirts of Millbrook like a scholar's fortress, surrounded by oak trees and overflowing bookshelves visible through every window. At 67, she had the kind of sharp intelligence that age had only refined, her silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, and her blue eyes magnified by wire-rimmed glasses that had gone out of style decades ago. She examined the 18 coins with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 40 years handling historical artifacts. Each piece was photographed, measured and scrutinized under a jeweler's loupe that she'd borrowed from the local pawn shop. "These are magnificent specimens," she said finally, setting down the last coin. "Liberty Head silver dollars from the 1840s, and in remarkably good condition considering they were buried in Tennessee clay for God knows how long." Tom and Ashley sat across from her at the dining room table, surrounded by reference books and manila folders filled with historical documents. The afternoon light streaming through the windows made the coins glow like small suns. "What are they worth?" Ashley asked, her hands unconsciously resting on her belly. "Individually, between $800 and $3,000 each, depending on the exact year and condition. But as a collection—" Helena paused, removing her glasses to clean them. "These aren't just valuable coins, my dear. They're historically significant. The dates, the condition, the fact that they were found together. This suggests they were buried as a hoard, probably during a time of crisis." "What kind of crisis?" Tom asked. "Well, the 1840s were turbulent times in Tennessee. The Mexican-American War, economic depression, political upheaval. People buried valuables when they feared for their safety or the stability of the banking system." Helena pulled out a leather-bound journal and began flipping through pages covered with her careful handwriting. "I've been researching your family's property since you called this morning. The land has been in Rodriguez's hands since 1851, when your great-great-grandfather, Matias Rodriguez, purchased it from the state land office." "Matias?" Tom frowned. "Grandpa never mentioned anyone named Matias." "That's not surprising. The family history gets a bit complicated around that time." Helena's expression grew serious. "Tell me, what did your grandfather tell you about how the family acquired the property?" "He said his great-grandfather was a farmer who saved up to buy land after coming from Mexico," Ashley replied. "A classic American dream story." "That's partially true, but the timeline doesn't quite work." Helena opened another folder, revealing old land deeds and tax records. "According to these documents, Matias Rodriguez paid cash for 200 acres in 1851. That's roughly $6,000 in period money, equivalent to about $200,000 today. Quite a fortune for an immigrant farmer." Tom felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your great-great-grandfather had access to significant wealth, and the source of that wealth is unclear." Helena spread several documents across the table. "There are gaps in the historical record. Missing years, where there's no trace of Matias Rodriguez in any official capacity, followed by sudden wealth and land ownership." Ashley studied the old deeds, noting the careful penmanship and official seals. "You think he was involved in something illegal?" The 1840s were the height of various entrepreneurial activities in Tennessee: smuggling, illegal whiskey production, even highway robbery. The state was largely lawless, and men could make fortunes quickly if they were willing to take risks. Or, Helena continued, reaching for another document, he could have been involved in legitimate but morally questionable activities. Slave trading, for instance, was enormously profitable during this period. The words hung in the air, like an indictment. Tom pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You're telling me my family fortune was built on slavery. I'm telling you that the evidence suggests your ancestor had access to significant wealth during a time when such wealth was often acquired through morally ambiguous means." Helena's voice remained scholarly and neutral. "The coins you found could be part of that original fortune. Money buried during the Civil War, perhaps, when Confederate sympathizers feared Union occupation." Ashley's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "Tom, we need to go. Now." "What's wrong?" She showed him the message from their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "Black SUV at your place again. Man in suit talking to someone with a camera." They made the drive back to the farm in record time, Tom's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel as he pushed his aging Ford beyond its comfort zone. As they crested the hill that led to their driveway, they could see the scene unfolding below. The same black Mercedes from earlier, now accompanied by a white van with a local news station's logo emblazoned on its side. "Shit," Tom breathed. Mitchell Hartwell stood on their front porch like he owned the place, gesturing broadly as he spoke to a blonde reporter in a red blazer. The cameraman was getting establishing shots of the farmhouse, focusing particularly on the peeling paint and sagging porch steps. Tom parked the truck aggressively, gravel flying as he slammed on the brakes. He was out of the vehicle before the engine had fully stopped, Ashley struggling to keep up as he stalked toward the porch. "A tragic case of elder abuse disguised as inheritance," Hartwell was saying to the camera. "My client simply wants to ensure that his grandfather's final wishes are respected, not exploited by family members who may have taken advantage of his declining mental state." "Get the hell off my property!" Tom shouted, his voice cracking with rage. The reporter, a polished woman in her 30s named Jennifer Walsh, turned toward him with the predatory smile of someone who smelled blood in the water. "Mr. Rodriguez, Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. Would you like to respond to allegations that you and your wife manipulated your grandfather into leaving you his property?" "We don't have any comment," Ashley said, trying to insert herself between Tom and the camera. She could see the signs of an impending anxiety attack in her husband's posture, the rapid breathing, the clenched fists, the way his eyes darted around looking for escape routes. "According to medical records," the reporter continued, "Eduardo Rodriguez was suffering from dementia in his final months. Can you explain how a man with diminished mental capacity came to leave his entire estate to the family members who were caring for him?" "He wasn't suffering from dementia," Tom exploded. "He was sharp as anyone until the day he died." Hartwell stepped forward smoothly. Perhaps Mr. Rodriguez wasn't aware of his grandfather's condition. After all, families often enable these situations without realizing the extent of a loved one's cognitive decline. The implication was clear. They were either manipulative or oblivious, neither of which looked good on camera. Ashley grabbed Tom's arm, feeling the tremor in his muscles that meant he was seconds away from either a panic attack or an explosion of anger. "We're done here. Please leave our property." "Just one more question," Walsh pressed. "There are rumors that valuable artifacts have been discovered on the property. Can you confirm that you found anything of historical or monetary significance?" Tom's face went ashen. Someone had been talking. But who? The only people who knew about the coins were Dr. Morrison and themselves. "No comment," Ashley said firmly, but the damage was done. The reporter's expression shifted, catching the scent of a bigger story. "Mr. Hartwell, is your client aware of any valuable discoveries on the disputed property?" Hartwell's smile was razor-sharp. "My client is naturally concerned about the preservation of any family heirlooms or historical artifacts that rightfully belong to the Rodriguez estate. If such items have been found, they should be properly appraised and included in any legal proceedings." After the news crew finally left, Tom and Ashley sat in their kitchen staring at the 18 silver coins still wrapped in the dish towel. The objects that had seemed like salvation that morning now felt like evidence in a criminal case. "How did they know?" Tom asked. "I don't know. Dr. Morrison wouldn't have said anything. Someone's been watching us, or listening to our phone calls, or—" Tom's voice trailed off as paranoia began to set in. Ashley's phone rang, the caller ID showing Dr. Morrison's number. "Ashley, dear, I just saw the news report." Helena's voice was tight with concern. "I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing information about your coins." "What kind of information?" "I've been doing more research since you left, cross-referencing the dates and denominations with historical records. I found something in the archives of the Tennessee State Library that you need to see. Can't you just tell us over the phone? Not this. You need to see the actual documents. Can you come back tonight? After dark, preferably. I'd rather not have any more visitors than necessary." The drive back to Dr. Morrison's house felt like a journey into increasingly dangerous territory. The October night was cold and clear, stars visible in the rural sky, unpolluted by city lights. Helena met them at the door, her usual academic composure replaced by obvious anxiety. "I found records of your coins," she said without preamble, leading them to her study. "Or rather, coins exactly like yours." The room was a shrine to Tennessee history, with maps covering the walls and filing cabinets stuffed with decades of research. On her desk lay a photocopy of an old newspaper article, the text barely legible, but the headline clear: "Train robbery yields $30,000 in silver." "This is from the Nashville Union, dated September 15th, 1851, Helena explained. "A gang of bandits robbed a passenger train carrying silver coins from New Orleans to Louisville. The stolen money was never recovered." Ashley felt her stomach drop. "You think our coins are from a train robbery?" The dates match perfectly, and the total amount stolen was described as approximately 500 Liberty Head silver dollars from various years in the 1840s. "Your 18 coins could easily be part of that haul." Tom was studying the newspaper article, his expression growing darker by the minute. "Who led the robbery?" Helena hesitated before pointing to a name in the faded text. "The gang was reportedly led by a Mexican immigrant named Matias Rodriguez, who was never apprehended." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands, while Ashley stared at the document that had just rewritten their family history. "So our great-great-grandfather wasn't a hard-working farmer," Ashley said quietly. "He was a train robber." "It appears so. And if these coins are part of the stolen silver, they're not legally yours. They belong to the railroad company, or more likely, their insurance company. Even after 170 years. Stolen property doesn't become legal property simply due to the passage of time," Helena explained gently. "If these coins can be proven to be part of the train robbery, they'll have to be surrendered to the authorities." Tom looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and despair. "So we lose everything. The farm, the coins, our reputation, all of it." "Not necessarily," Helena said. "There might be a way to prove that your family has legitimate claim to the property, even if Matthias used stolen money to purchase it. But it would require extensive legal research and lawyers cost money we don't have," Ashley finished. Helena nodded sympathetically. "I'm afraid so." As they prepared to leave, Helena walked them to the door, her expression troubled. "There's something else you should know. I made some discreet inquiries about Connor Rodriguez this afternoon." "What kind of inquiries?" "He's been asking questions around town for months, long before your grandfather died. Questions about the family property, about potential historical significance, about whether any artifacts had ever been found on the land." Tom stopped in his tracks. "Are you saying he knew about the coins?" "I'm saying he's been unusually interested in your property for someone who allegedly just learned about his inheritance concerns. One has to wonder if his legal challenge is really about your grandfather's mental capacity or if it's about something else entirely." The drive home was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into their driveway, Ashley noticed that Charlie was once again digging behind the barn, his enthusiasm undiminished despite the darkness. "He's still at it," she observed. Tom parked the truck and sat for a moment, staring at their house, the home that might not be theirs much longer. "Ashley, what if there's more? What if those 18 coins are just the beginning?" "You want to keep digging?" "I want to know the truth. All of it. If Connor's been sniffing around for months, if he somehow knows about family treasure, then maybe there's more to find. Maybe enough to fight back." Ashley looked at her husband, seeing something in his expression that had been missing for months. Determination. The scared, anxious veteran was still there, but underneath was the man who had led soldiers through combat zones, who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure. "What are you thinking?" Tom's smile was grim, but genuine. "I'm thinking we dig up the whole damn farm if we have to. If Matias Rodriguez buried stolen treasure on this property, then we find all of it before Connor does. And then we figure out how to use it." They walked toward the barn together, flashlights in hand, ready to uncover whatever secrets their family had buried in the Tennessee soil. Charlie wagged his tail as they approached, as if he'd been waiting for them to finally understand what he'd been trying to tell them all along. But as Tom aimed his flashlight into the hole, illuminating something that definitely wasn't another coin, they realized that some family secrets were darker than stolen silver. But as Tom aimed his flashlight into the hole, illuminating something that definitely wasn't another coin, they realized that some family secrets were darker than stolen silver. Much darker. The object in the beam of Tom's flashlight was unmistakably human. The curved arc of a ribcage, yellowed with age and partially obscured by decades of accumulated soil. Ashley's sharp intake of breath cut through the October night like a blade. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, his light wavering as his hand began to shake. Charlie had stopped digging and was now sitting perfectly still, his tail no longer wagging, as if he too understood the gravity of what he'd uncovered. The golden retriever's instincts had led them to treasure, but also to something far more sinister. "We need to call the police," Ashley said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And tell them what? That we found a body while we were digging for stolen treasure?" Tom's anxiety was spiraling, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "They'll think we killed someone. They'll think we're trying to cover it up." Ashley grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her instead of the remains in the hole. "Tom, listen to me. This person has been dead for decades, maybe longer. Look at the condition of the bones. This isn't recent." She was right. Even in the uncertain light of their flashlights, it was clear that these weren't fresh remains. The bones were discolored and brittle, partially decomposed into the clay soil. Whatever had happened here had occurred long before either of them was born. "We still have to report it," Ashley insisted. "It's the law. And give Connor exactly what he needs to prove we're unfit to inherit this property." Tom's voice was rising, the stress of the past day finally overwhelming his ability to cope. "They'll shut down the whole farm as a crime scene. We'll lose everything. We might lose everything anyway if we don't handle this right." They stood in the darkness, neither knowing what to do next, when the sound of a car engine broke the silence. Headlights swept across the farmyard as a vehicle turned into their driveway. "Hide the bones," Tom said urgently. "Tom, we can't. Just throw some dirt over them now." They frantically began shoveling soil back into the hole, Charlie watching with obvious confusion as his archaeological work was undone. The headlights were getting closer, and they could now identify the vehicle as Dr. Morrison's aging Subaru. Helena Morrison climbed out of her car, looking every bit as anxious as they felt. She was carrying a manila folder and a heavy flashlight, her academic composure replaced by obvious urgency. "I'm sorry to come so late," she said, "but I found something else, something that couldn't wait until morning." She stopped abruptly, noticing their dirt-covered clothes and guilty expressions. "What's wrong? What did you find?" Tom and Ashley exchanged glances. If they were going to trust anyone with this discovery, Dr. Morrison was probably their best option. She had the expertise to help them understand what they'd uncovered, and more importantly, she seemed genuinely invested in helping them rather than exploiting them. "Show her," Ashley said quietly. Tom reluctantly began clearing away the soil they'd just thrown back into the hole. Within moments, the skeletal remains were visible again, even more disturbing in the harsh beam of Helena's professional-grade flashlight. "Dear God," Helena breathed. She knelt beside the excavation, her academic instincts overriding any squeamishness. "This is definitely human, and quite old. Look at the position. This person was buried deliberately, not just dumped here." "How can you tell?" Ashley asked. "The body is laid out in a formal position, arms crossed over the chest. That suggests ritual burial, not a hasty disposal. And see this?" She pointed to something gleaming near the skull. "There's metal here, possibly a belt buckle or jewelry." Using a small brush from her research kit, Helena carefully cleared away more soil, revealing what appeared to be the remnants of clothing and personal effects. The metal object was indeed a belt buckle, ornate and well-preserved, with an inscription that was still partially legible. "Can you make out what it says?" Tom asked. Helena adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. "It's in Spanish, I think. Matthias something 1851. The date hit them like a physical blow. Ashley sank onto an overturned bucket, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "Matthias Rodriguez," she whispered. "This is him, isn't it? Your great-great-grandfather." Tom stared at the remains of his ancestor, trying to process the implications. So he didn't disappear after the train robbery. He died here, on his own property. "Or was killed here," Helena corrected gently. "The question is, by whom and why?" She opened the folder she'd brought and pulled out several photocopied documents. "This is what I came to show you. I found more information about the train robbery and about what happened to Matthias Rodriguez afterward." Even by flashlight, the newspaper clippings were readable. The headlines told a story of escalating violence. "Rodriguez gang strikes again. Reward offered for train robbers." And finally, "Bandit leader believed dead." According to these reports, Helena explained, Matthias Rodriguez and his gang robbed 3 trains and a stagecoach between 1850 and 1851. They were responsible for at least 2 deaths, a train conductor and a passenger who tried to resist. The authorities put a $1,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive. "So someone collected that bounty," Tom said. "It appears so." The last newspaper report, dated October 1851, suggests that Rodriguez was killed by bounty hunters, but his body was never recovered. The authorities assumed he'd been disposed of in the wilderness. Ashley was studying the remains with morbid fascination. But he wasn't killed in the wilderness. He was buried here on the property he'd bought with stolen money. "Which raises the question," Helena said, "of who buried him, and who's been keeping this secret for 170 years. The sound of another vehicle approaching made them all freeze. This time it wasn't a single car. It sounded like multiple vehicles moving fast and with purpose. "Shit," Tom muttered, recognizing the distinctive rumble of diesel engines. "Those are trucks." 3 pickup trucks roared into their drivyard, their headlights blazing like searchlights. Men began piling out before the vehicles had fully stopped, and Tom counted at least 8 figures silhouetted against the harsh light. "Tom Rodriguez!" a familiar voice called out. "We need to talk!" Connor Rodriguez stepped into the light, but he wasn't alone. The men with him were large, rough-looking, and several were carrying what appeared to be shovels and metal detectors. Connor himself looked different from the polished businessman Tom remembered. His expensive clothes were replaced by work boots and jeans, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. "Connor," Tom said, stepping protectively in front of the excavation. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," Connor replied, his eyes scanning the scene and taking in the dirt-covered trio, the flashlights, and the obvious signs of digging. "Midnight archaeology session." "This is private property," Ashley said. "You're trespassing." Connor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Private property? That's debatable, cousin, especially when that property is hiding things that belong to the whole family." One of his men, a bearded giant wearing a John Deere cap, stepped forward with a metal detector in his hands. "Found fresh digging over here, boss. Lots of it." "I figured as much," Connor said. "See, Tom, I've been having this place watched for weeks. Amazing what people will do when they think nobody's looking." Dr. Morrison cleared her throat. "Mr. Rodriguez, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Dr. Helena Morrison, and I have to say that this is highly irregular behavior." "Dr. Morrison," Connor said with mock politeness. "The local historian. I've heard about you. Been feeding my cousin here stories about family treasure, have you? I've been providing historical context for artifacts they discovered on their property." "Their property," Connor repeated. "That's where you're wrong, Doc. This property was bought with stolen money by a murderer and a thief. That makes any claim to it illegitimate." Tom's temper finally snapped. "You son of a bitch! You've known about Matthias all along, haven't you? The whole dementia story, the legal challenge. It was all bullshit to cover up what you're really after." Connor's mask of civility dropped away entirely. "Damn right I knew about Matthias. Our great-great-grandfather was a train robber who stole a fortune and buried it on this land. My grandfather told me stories when I was a kid, but the old bastards in this family never shared the location. They kept it all to themselves." "Oh, so you waited until Grandpa Eduardo died and then swooped in," Ashley said. "I waited until the old man was finally out of the way, yes. Eduardo knew where the treasure was buried, but he was too stubborn and too proud to admit what Matthias really was. He preferred the fairy tale about the hard-working immigrant farmer." Helena stepped forward, her voice sharp with academic authority. "Even if you're right about the treasure, you can't just come here with armed men and start digging. This is still a legal matter." "Legal?" Connor laughed again. "Lady, there's nothing legal about this whole situation. The property was bought with blood money, the treasure was stolen from innocent people, and my cousin here has been sitting on family history that he had no right to keep secret." The bearded man had continued sweeping his metal detector around the yard, and suddenly the device began beeping frantically. "Got something big over here, Connor. Multiple targets." Connor's eyes lit up with greed. "Start digging, boys." "Like hell you will," Tom said, but he was outnumbered 8-3, and several of Connor's men looked like they'd be perfectly comfortable with violence. That's when Ashley made a decision that changed everything. "There's a dead body in this hole," she announced loudly. The digging stopped. Connor's men exchanged uncertain glances, and even Connor himself seemed taken aback. "What did you say?" "A skeleton," Helena confirmed. "Human remains, approximately 170 years old, buried in a formal manner, with period clothing and personal effects." Connor approached the excavation, his flashlight beam revealing the unmistakable outline of bones. "Jesus Christ! Is that—" "Matthias Rodriguez," Tom said. "Our great-great-grandfather, shot dead by bounty hunters and buried right here on his own property." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Connor stared at the remains of his ancestor, his expression shifting from greed to something approaching respect. "The bastard never left," he said quietly. "He's been here all along." "Which means this is a crime scene," Ashley pointed out. "Or at least an archaeological site. Either way, it has to be properly excavated by professionals." "And reported to the authorities," Helena added. "Human remains, regardless of age, require official investigation." Connor's business mind was clearly working, calculating the implications. A crime scene would shut down any treasure hunting activities indefinitely. Official investigation would bring unwanted scrutiny. And most importantly, it would delay any resolution to the property dispute for months or even years. "Nobody's calling anyone," he said finally. "Connor, you can't—" Tom began. "Nobody," Connor repeated, his voice harder now, "is calling anyone until we figure out what else is buried here." Matthias stole $500,000 in today's money, and most of it is still missing. I'm not letting the government seize this property and turn it into some kind of historical preserve, while bureaucrats decide who has rights to what. One of his men, apparently named Billy, spoke up. Connor, if there's a body here, this could get real complicated real fast. Only if people start talking, Connor replied, his gaze moving from Tom to Ashley to Helena. And I don't think anyone here wants to deal with that kind of complication, do they? The threat was implicit, but clear. Connor had money, influence, and men willing to do his bidding. Tom and Ashley were broke, isolated, and completely outgunned. But Helena Morrison had spent 40 years dealing with powerful men who thought they could intimidate academics into compliance. Mr. Rodriguez, she said calmly, you're suggesting that we conspire to conceal evidence of a potential crime scene. That would make us all accessories after the fact, regardless of how old these remains are. I'm suggesting that we're all family here, Connor said, and family takes care of family business privately. We're not family, Ashley said. You've made that very clear. Connor's expression softened slightly, and for a moment he looked almost genuinely regretful. Look, Ashley, Tom, I know this got out of hand. I know I came on too strong with the legal stuff. But this is bigger than any of us realized. There's enough treasure buried on this property to set up our kids' for life. We can all walk away from this rich if we handle it right. And if we handle it wrong? Tom asked. Connor's pause was answer enough. Helena cleared her throat. I believe I have a solution that might work for everyone. All eyes turned to the elderly historian, who had been quietly observing the standoff while her academic mind worked through the possibilities. Give me 24 hours, she said. Let me research the legal implications of finding human remains on private property, particularly remains that may be connected to historical crimes. There might be ways to handle this that protect everyone's interests while still following the law. What kind of ways? Connor asked suspiciously. Historical preservation grants, archaeological exemptions, private excavation permits. There are legal frameworks for dealing with situations like this. But I need time to make the right contacts and file the proper paperwork. Connor looked around at his men, then back at the hole containing his ancestors' remains. 24 hours, but nobody leaves this property, and nobody makes any phone calls. We all stay here and figure this out together. That's kidnapping, Ashley pointed out. That's family reunion, Connor corrected. We're all going to get to know each other real well over the next day or so. As Connor's men began setting up what amounted to a camp in their farmyard, Tom and Ashley found themselves prisoners in their own home. The coins that had seemed like salvation 12 hours ago now felt like evidence in a case that was spiraling far beyond their control. But as Tom watched Charlie resume his digging with renewed enthusiasm, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only scratched the surface of the Rodriguez family secrets. The dog had found treasure and bones. What else was buried in their backyard? Dawn broke grey and cold over the Rodriguez farm, revealing the surreal tableau that had developed overnight. Connor's men had positioned themselves strategically around the property like an occupying force. 2 stood guard by the house, 2 more by the barn, and the remaining 4 had worked in shifts through the night, systematically searching the grounds with metal detectors and shovels. Tom stood at his kitchen window, watching the systematic desecration of his family's land while nursing his 3rd cup of coffee. Ashley sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold, her face pale with exhaustion and morning sickness. Neither had slept more than an hour, taking turns keeping watch and trying to process everything that had happened. They've torn up half the backyard, Tom said quietly, his voice hoarse from stress and lack of sleep. Through the window, they could see that Connor's treasure hunters had been busy. What had started as Charlie's single hole behind the barn had expanded into a network of excavations across the property. The pristine yard that Eduardo had maintained with such pride now looked like a battlefield. Helena Morrison sat in Eduardo's old recliner in the living room, surrounded by the legal documents and historical research she'd compiled throughout the night. Despite being in her late 60s and held prisoner by armed men, she'd maintained her academic composure and had spent the dark hours working on their problem with the methodical precision of a seasoned researcher. "I've found something," she called out, her voice carrying a note of excitement that had been absent the night before. Tom and Ashley joined her in the living room, careful to keep their voices low. Connor had claimed the master bedroom for himself, and they could hear him talking on the phone through the closed door, apparently conducting business calls as if this were just another day at the office. "What did you find?" Ashley asked. Helena spread several documents across the coffee table, her expression mixing triumph with concern. "I've been researching the legal precedents for situations like this, and there's something called the Archaeological Resources Protection Act that might work in our favor." "How so?" Tom asked. "If we can prove that the remains and artifacts found on this property have significant historical value, which they clearly do, then we can petition for the site to be designated as a protected archaeological location. That would give us legal standing to control access to the property and prevent unauthorized excavation." Ashley leaned forward, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Would that stop Connor? It would make his activities here federal crimes rather than just civil disputes. The penalties for disturbing protected archaeological sites include heavy fines and prison time." "But there's a catch, isn't there?" Tom said, recognizing the hesitation in Helena's voice. "The application process requires full disclosure of what's been found, including the human remains. And once the site is designated as archaeological, any artifacts recovered become property of the federal government." Tom slumped back in his chair. "So we'd save the property but lose the treasure?" "Not necessarily," Helena said. "There are provisions for finder's fees and compensation for landowners who cooperate with archaeological investigations. It wouldn't be the full value of the coins, but it could be substantial enough to cover your debts and legal fees." The sound of Connor's voice grew louder from the bedroom, and they could make out fragments of his conversation. "No, I don't care about the market opening. This is more important than some quarterly report." "He's been on the phone all night," Tom observed. "Making arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Ashley asked. Before anyone could answer, Charlie began barking frantically from the backyard. Through the window, they could see the golden retriever running in circles near one of the fresh excavations, his tail rigid with excitement. Billy, the bearded man who seemed to be Connor's second in command, was standing over a particular hole, shouting something to the other diggers. Within seconds, all four men had converged on the location, their metal detectors squealing in harmony. "They found something big," Helena observed. Connor emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed despite the early hour, his phone still pressed to his ear. "I don't care if the board meeting is today. Reschedule it, because I'm about to become the richest man in Tennessee, that's why." He ended the call and strode to the window, his expression shifting to predatory satisfaction as he watched his men work. "Looks like the Rodriguez family Christmas came early," he said to no one in particular. Through the window, they could see Billy pulling something substantial from the hole. Not coins this time, but what appeared to be a metal container about the size of a bread box. Even from a distance, they could see the excitement on the men's faces as they carefully lifted it from the ground. "That's it," Connor breathed. "That's what I've been looking for." He headed for the door, then paused and turned back to Tom, Ashley, and Helena. "You three stay put, and don't even think about trying to leave or make any phone calls. Jimmy's watching the road, and he's got instructions to stop anyone who tries to get past him." As Connor left to examine his discovery, Tom felt something snap inside him. This was his property, his family's land, and he was sitting in his own house like a prisoner while strangers pillaged everything his grandfather had worked to preserve. "I can't do this anymore," he said, standing up abruptly. "Tom, don't," Ashley warned. "You saw those men. They're not playing games." Neither am I. Tom's voice carried a determination that Ashley hadn't heard since before his last deployment to Afghanistan. This is our home, Ashley. Our baby's going to grow up here. I'm not letting Connor Rodriguez and his hired thugs steal our future. He headed toward the kitchen, where Eduardo's old hunting rifle hung on a rack above the fireplace. A decoration more than a weapon, but one that Tom knew was still functional. "Tom, stop," Helena said sharply. "Violence isn't going to solve this. We need to be smart about this." "Smart?" Tom turned back to face them, his eyes blazing with anger. "Connor has 8 armed men on our property. He's holding us prisoner, and he's stealing our inheritance. What part of being smart involves just sitting here and letting it happen?" Ashley stood up, moving to block his path to the rifle. "The part where we don't get ourselves killed. The part where our baby gets born with 2 living parents." The mention of their unborn child stopped Tom cold. Ashley pressed her advantage, placing her hands on his chest and speaking in the calm, steady voice she'd learned to use during his worst anxiety attacks. "We're going to get through this," she said, "but not by starting a gunfight. We can't win. Dr. Morrison has a plan. We need to trust that." Tom's breathing was rapid and shallow, the telltale signs of an impending panic attack. Ashley recognized the symptoms and immediately shifted into caregiver mode, guiding him to sit down and breathing with him until his heart rate began to slow. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I can't stand feeling helpless like this." "You're not helpless," Ashley said. "You're being strategic. There's a difference." Helena had been watching the exchange with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades observing human behavior under stress. "Tom, I've been thinking about something all night. Something about your grandfather's will." "What about it?" "Connor's lawyer claimed that Eduardo was suffering from dementia when he wrote his final will, correct?" "That's what they said. But what if the medical records were fabricated? What if Connor needed Eduardo to appear mentally incompetent in order to justify his legal challenge?" Tom looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You think Connor forged medical records?" "I think Connor Rodriguez is desperate enough to do whatever it takes to get his hands on this property, and desperate people make mistakes." Ashley was following Helena's logic. "If we could prove that the medical records were fake, then Connor's entire legal case collapses," Helena finished, "and his actions here today become simple trespassing and theft." Through the window, they could see that Connor's men had succeeded in opening the metal container they'd found. Even at a distance, the gleam of silver coins was unmistakable, and the men were passing handfuls of treasure back and forth like children with a new toy. Connor himself was on his phone again, pacing back and forth as he spoke animatedly to someone on the other end. From his gestures and expression, it was clear he was describing his discovery to someone important. "He's calling his buyers," Tom realized. "He's already arranged to sell whatever he found." "Which means he's been planning this for a long time," Ashley said. "Longer than he's been claiming." Helena was making notes on a legal pad, her academic mind working through the implications. "If we can establish that Connor has been planning this treasure hunt for months or even years, it undermines his claim that he only recently learned about irregularities in Eduardo's will." "But how do we prove any of this?" Tom asked. "We need evidence, phone records, financial transactions, witnesses who can testify about Connor's behavior before Eduardo's death. And we need to get that evidence to the right people," Ashley added, "which means getting off this property and contacting the authorities." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts about how to accomplish what seemed impossible. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and effectively imprisoned. Connor controlled the roads leading to and from the farm, and he had enough manpower to watch their every move. That's when Charlie provided an unexpected solution. The golden retriever had been barking steadily for several minutes, but now his vocalizations had changed to the specific bark he used when strangers approached the property. Through the front window, they could see a familiar white van making its way up the driveway, the same Channel 7 news van that had been there the day before. "Jennifer Walsh," Ashley breathed. "The reporter." Connor's men were scrambling to hide their excavation equipment and cover the holes they'd dug, but it was too late. The news crew had already seen enough to know that major digging operations were underway. Connor himself was striding toward the news van, his expression thunderous. Even through the closed windows of the house, they could hear him shouting, "This is private property! You're trespassing!" Jennifer Walsh climbed out of the van with the confident stride of a reporter who'd covered dangerous stories before. Her cameraman followed, already filming as Connor approached. "Mr. Rodriguez," Walsh called out. "Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. Can you comment on reports that armed men are conducting unauthorized archaeological excavations on disputed property?" "No comment," Connor snapped. "Get off this land now, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "On whose authority?" Walsh pressed. "According to county records, this property belongs to Thomas Rodriguez, not Connor Rodriguez. Do you have permission from the legal owner to be conducting these activities?" Tom felt a surge of hope. The reporter had done her homework and was asking exactly the right questions. More importantly, she was broadcasting those questions live, which meant Connor couldn't simply make her disappear the way he'd effectively disappeared them. "There's our chance," Helena said quietly, while Connor's distracted with the news crew. Ashley was already moving toward the back door. "The old deer trail behind the barn leads to the Patterson property. If we can get through the woods to their house, we can call for help." Tom hesitated. "What about Dr. Morrison?" "I'll be fine," Helena said. "I'm too old and too stubborn for Connor to intimidate. Besides, someone needs to stay here and document what's happening. Go." They slipped out the back door, while Connor was still arguing with the news crew in the front yard. Charlie bounded after them, apparently thrilled to be part of whatever adventure they were embarking on. The woods behind the Rodriguez farm were thick with October foliage, providing excellent cover but making movement slow and difficult. Ashley was already breathing hard from the exertion, and Tom had to fight down his anxiety about leaving her alone if something went wrong. They'd made it perhaps a quarter mile through the trees when they heard the unmistakable sound of Connor's voice raised in anger, followed by the slam of vehicle doors. The news crew had apparently been forced to leave, which meant Connor would soon discover their absence. "We need to move faster," Tom said. "I'm trying," Ashley gasped. "But I can't. The morning sickness." She stopped abruptly and doubled over, retching into the underbrush. Tom held her hair back and rubbed her shoulders, his heart breaking at the sight of his pregnant wife forced to flee through the woods like a refugee. "I'm okay," she said finally, straightening up with determination. "Let's keep going." They pressed on through the forest, guided by Tom's childhood memories of hunting these woods with his grandfather. Eduardo had taught him every deer trail, every creek crossing, every shortcut through the maze of oak and hickory trees. 20 minutes later, they emerged from the woods behind the Patterson farm, a modest spread that bordered their property to the east. Mrs. Patterson was in her garden, harvesting the last of her fall vegetables, when she looked up to see her neighbors stumbling out of the forest like escaped prisoners. "Tom? Ashley? What in the world are you doing running through the woods?" "Mrs. Patterson," Ashley gasped, "we need to use your phone. It's an emergency." Eleanor Patterson was 73 years old and had lived in rural Tennessee long enough to recognize genuine trouble when she saw it. She took one look at their dirt-covered clothes, Ashley's pale face, and Tom's barely controlled panic, and immediately ushered them into her kitchen. "Sheriff's Department or State Police?" she asked, already reaching for her phone. "Both," Tom said. "And maybe the FBI. I'm not sure who has jurisdiction over archaeological crimes." As Ashley spoke rapidly to a 911 dispatcher, explaining their situation in terms that sounded almost too bizarre to be true, Tom found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories. Eduardo had always said that the most important thing about owning land wasn't the dirt itself, but the community that surrounded it. Mrs. Patterson was proof of that wisdom. She'd fed them, sheltered them, and was now helping them fight for their future without asking for anything in return except the truth. The truth, Tom realized, was going to be the key to everything that happened next. The question was whether they'd discovered it in time to save their home, their marriage, and their future. Through Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window, they could see smoke rising from the direction of their farm. Not the smoke of a house fire, but the controlled burn of someone destroying evidence. Connor Rodriguez was cleaning up loose ends, and Tom and Ashley had just become the loosest ends of all. The cavalry arrived in force. Tom and Ashley watched from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen window as a convoy of law enforcement vehicles descended on their farm like something from an action movie. 2 sheriff's department cruisers led the procession, followed by an unmarked sedan that Tom suspected belonged to the state police, and bringing up the rear, a black SUV with federal plates that made Ashley's heart skip a beat. "FBI," she breathed. "They actually sent the FBI." Mrs. Patterson, who had lived through enough excitement for one lifetime, was calmly making sandwiches as if armed standoffs in neighboring yards were a regular occurrence in rural Tennessee. "Y'all are going to need your strength," she said pragmatically. "This kind of thing can take all day to sort out." Through the window, they could see Connor's men scrambling as law enforcement officers took positions around the property. The systematic, professional manner in which the officers moved told Tom everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking the situation. His phone, which he'd retrieved from Mrs. Patterson's house phone to call Ashley, now rang with an unknown number. "Tom Rodriguez?" The voice was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably federal. "This is Special Agent Patricia Wells, FBI. We need to speak with you immediately." "Are you related to Dr. Patricia Wells?" Tom asked, remembering the name from Eduardo's alleged medical records. There was a pause. "Dr. Patricia Wells is my mother, and I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." 20 minutes later, Tom and Ashley found themselves sitting in the back of Agent Wells's SUV, parked at a safe distance from their house, but close enough to observe the unfolding drama. Special Agent Patricia Wells was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely grey hair, wearing a no-nonsense pantsuit that suggested she meant business. "Let me start by saying that my mother never treated your grandfather for dementia," she said without preamble. "In fact, she never treated Eduardo Rodriguez for anything. Her medical records were forged." Ashley felt vindicated, but also horrified. "How do you know?" "Because when Connor Rodriguez's lawyer submitted those medical records as evidence in his legal challenge, the court forwarded them to my mother's office for verification. She immediately recognized them as fraudulent. Her signature was forged, the letterhead was wrong, and the patient information was completely fabricated." Tom leaned forward. "So you opened an investigation?" "We opened several investigations," Agent Wells corrected. "Wire fraud for the forged documents, archaeological crimes for the unauthorized excavation, conspiracy for the organized nature of the operation, and potentially kidnapping based on your report that you were held against your will." Through the SUV's windshield, they could see Connor Rodriguez in animated discussion with Sheriff Murphy, his hands gesturing wildly as he apparently tried to explain away the presence of armed men, excavated treasure, and buried human remains on someone else's property. "What about the treasure?" Ashley asked. "The coins, the silver, what happens to all of that?" Agent Wells pulled out a tablet and showed them photographs that had clearly been taken during the night's excavation. The images showed stacks of silver coins, jewelry, and other valuable artifacts, far more than the 18 coins Charlie had originally discovered. "Based on our preliminary assessment, we're looking at approximately $2. $3 million worth of historical artifacts, including the coins you found and the additional items recovered by Mr. Connor Rodriguez's excavation team." "Jesus," Tom whispered. "The legal status of these items is complex," Agent Wells continued. "They appear to be proceeds from crimes committed in the 1850s, which complicates ownership claims. However, there are several factors working in your favor." She flipped through screens on her tablet, showing them legal documents and precedent cases. First, the statute of limitations on the original crimes has long since expired. Second, your family has maintained continuous legal ownership of the property for over 170 years. Third, you reported the discovery to authorities voluntarily, which demonstrates good faith. So we get to keep it? Ashley asked hopefully. Not all of it. The federal government will take possession of the most historically significant pieces for museum preservation. But you'll receive finder's fees and compensation that should amount to approximately 40% of the total value. Tom did the math in his head. 40% of $2.3 million was nearly $1 million. Enough to pay off every debt they had, secure their baby's future, and probably buy half the county if they wanted to. "What about Connor?" he asked. Agent Wells's expression hardened. "Connor Rodriguez is in serious legal trouble. Wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. Add in the archaeological crimes, the conspiracy charges, and the fact that he hired armed men to hold you prisoner on your own property, and he's looking at significant jail time." As if summoned by their conversation, Connor Rodriguez appeared at the SUV's window, flanked by 2 FBI agents who were clearly not giving him much choice about where he went. His expensive clothes were rumpled and dirty, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his face bore the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Agent Wells rolled down the window. "Connor!" Tom said, not without some sympathy, despite everything that had happened. "Tom!" Connor replied, his voice defeated. "I want you to know, I never meant for it to go this far. I've been planning this for so long. Ever since I was a kid, and my dad told me stories about the family treasure." "Why didn't you just ask?" Ashley said. "We would have shared whatever we found. We're family." Connor's laugh was bitter. "Are we? You think I didn't know how Eduardo felt about my side of the family? The successful side, the side that didn't need handouts and charity? He looked down on us because we made something of ourselves instead of staying poor and noble on the family farm." "Grandpa never looked down on you," Tom said quietly. He was proud that the family had produced successful people. He just didn't understand why success had to come at the cost of forgetting where you came from. "Maybe," Connor said. "Maybe I misjudged him. And maybe I misjudged you." Agent Wells cleared her throat. "Mr. Rodriguez, we need to continue this conversation at the federal building." As Connor was led away, Tom felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at what his cousin had put them through, sadness at the family rift that had led to this confrontation, and surprisingly, a small measure of pity for a man who had lost everything in pursuit of treasure that wasn't even his to claim. Dr. Helena Morrison emerged from their house, escorted by a sheriff's deputy, her arms full of historical documents, and her expression mixing relief with academic excitement. She spotted them in the SUV and hurried over. "Are you two all right?" she asked, her maternal instincts overriding her scholarly composure. "We're fine," Ashley assured her. "What happened after we left?" "Connor tried to destroy evidence, burning documents, reburying some of the artifacts, even attempting to move Matthias's remains. But I documented everything with my camera, and the authorities arrived before he could complete his cover-up." The goon. Helena pulled out her phone and showed them dozens of photographs she'd taken throughout the ordeal. "This is going to make an extraordinary case study in family archaeology and the intersection of crime and history." "You're going to write about this?" Tom asked. "With your permission, of course. The Rodriguez family story, the train robber, the buried treasure, the family feud. It's exactly the kind of human drama that makes history come alive for people." Ashley looked at Tom, and he nodded. They'd been through too much to worry about privacy now. "Just change the names," Ashley requested. "We'd like our baby to grow up with some anonymity." 6 months later, Tom Rodriguez stood in the same spot behind the barn where Charlie had first started digging, but the scene was dramatically different. The excavation site had been transformed into a professional archaeological dig, complete with graduate students, precise grid markers, and careful documentation of every artifact recovered. Dr. Morrison supervised the work with the enthusiasm of someone half her age, while Charlie wandered among the diggers like a canine consultant, occasionally offering unsolicited advice about where they should be looking. Ashley sat on a folding chair in the shade, her pregnant belly now prominently visible under her maternity clothes, watching the organized chaos with bemused satisfaction. The baby was due in 2 weeks, and they'd already converted Eduardo's old office into a nursery, painted in gender-neutral yellows and greens. The financial compensation from the archaeological find had exceeded Agent Wells' estimates. After legal fees and taxes, they'd netted nearly $800,000, more than enough to secure their future and establish a college fund for their unborn child. They'd also used some of the money to establish the Eduardo Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship at the local community college, funding agricultural studies for students from low-income families. "Any word from Connor?" Ashley asked, as Tom joined her in the shade. "His lawyer called yesterday. The plea bargain went through. 18 months in federal prison, plus restitution and community service. He'll be out before the baby's old enough to remember Uncle Connor being in jail." "Are you going to visit him?" Tom considered the question. 6 months ago, the answer would have been an emphatic no, but time and perspective had softened his anger into something approaching understanding. "Maybe, after the baby's born. Family's family, right?" Ashley smiled and took his hand, placing it on her belly, where their child was performing what felt like Olympic gymnastics. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." "I hope so." Dr. Morrison approached them with mud-caked boots and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just made an important discovery. "We found something," she announced. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about Matias Rodriguez." She held up a leather-bound journal, water-damaged but still largely intact, that had been buried alongside their ancestors' remains. "It's his diary, and according to the entries, Matias Rodriguez wasn't just a train robber. He was working with the Underground Railroad, using his outlaw reputation as cover for helping escaped slaves reach freedom. The train robberies were real, but the money was being used to fund safe houses and buy freedom for enslaved families. Tom stared at the journal, trying to process this latest revelation about his family's complicated history. "So he was a criminal and a hero?" Ashley asked. "He was a man trying to do right in a world that offered few legal ways to fight injustice," Helena replied. "The journal describes his moral struggle with his methods, but also his commitment to the cause. He saved dozens of lives, possibly hundreds." She opened the journal to a page near the end, pointing to an entry written in faded Spanish. "This is dated just days before his death. He writes about burying the remaining silver for future generations of his family, hoping they would use it to continue the fight for justice in whatever form their era required." Tom felt tears welling up in his eyes as the full weight of his inheritance settled on him. It wasn't just money or property. It was a legacy of standing up for what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. "What do we do now?" he asked. Helena smiled, closing the journal carefully and handing it to him. "We honor his memory by living up to his example. We use what he left us to make the world a little bit better." Nay. As the sun set over the Rodriguez farm, painting the Tennessee sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tom and Ashley sat together watching their child's inheritance being carefully excavated from the soil that had protected it for generations. Charlie, exhausted from his day of supervising archaeological work, lay at their feet with his head resting on Tom's boots. The golden retriever's tail wagged slowly as he dreamed, perhaps of more treasures waiting to be discovered in the rich Tennessee earth. But Tom and Ashley had already found the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that they were part of a family legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling, and a future worth fighting for. The baby kicked vigorously against Ashley's ribs, as if eager to join the family business of uncovering buried secrets and standing up to powerful people who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. "I think this one's going to be trouble," Ashley said, rubbing her belly affectionately. "Good," Tom replied, squeezing her hand. "The Rodriguez family could use a little more trouble." In the distance, Dr. Morrison's voice could be heard, calling to her students about another significant discovery. Charlie's ears perked up at the sound, but he was too comfortable to move from his position as the family guard dog. Some treasures, after all, were too valuable to leave unprotected, and some legacies were too important to let slip away.